Hello everyone, and welcome to American Thought Leaders Now, our spin-off series of the original American Thought Leaders program. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. Our associate producer here on the show, American Thought Leaders, is Karis Rea. Karis has also been involved in a number of different Jewish organizations, including the Jewish Leadership Project. And we're going to talk about the situation in Israel together. Karis, it's great to have you.
It's so great to be here on camera with you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's amazing. You know, you're usually behind the scenes, and we've been talking a lot about what has actually transpired in Israel with this Hamas invasion. And I guess we just decided that we have to share some of our thinking. Why don't you just tell me, for starters, how you think things stand?
Yeah, so today there have been about 1,200 Israelis that have been butchered by Hamas terrorists. That is the equivalent to around 30 or 40,000 Americans if you adjust for population. And this is a very big deal, not just for Israelis, but for Jews around the world, because this is the greatest loss of Jewish life in a single day since the Holocaust. And I don't think that a lot of people watching this from the outside necessarily understand that Israel's a very small country. It has about 9 or 10 million people in it. And, you know, it's the size of New Jersey. It's very small. And it's surrounded by enemies and existentially trying to survive as the sole Jewish state in the world amidst a sea of about 50 Muslim states and many Christian majority states. So I think Jews and anti-Semitism are frequently taken out of the equation here, what's going on. But for both diasporan Jews and Jews in Israel, this is really an attack on their identity.
Well, I want to mention one more thing here, that there's only about, a lot of people don't realize this, there's only about 14 million Jews in the world. And you know, somehow I've actually tried asking people from time to time what they think, and they generally believe it's a much larger number.
Right, and this is in comparison to about 1.5 billion Christians, I think is the latest estimate, and about 1.4 billion Muslims. So if you just imagine that, if you imagine 14 or 15 million Jews next to over 1 billion Muslims and Christians, I think that really puts the whole thing in perspective. I think Americans might be shocked by that statistic because we are all familiar with the Jewish community, right? I mean, half of these 14 or 15 million Jews basically live in the U.S., and the other half lives in Israel. And then there's a small community here and there in France, in Britain, in Argentina. But the Jews have virtually been wiped out from most places in the world, including the Middle East. You know, a lot of people are familiar with Palestinian refugees, but not a lot of people are familiar with the fact that close to 1 million Jewish inhabitants of Arab countries were ethnically cleansed in the late 1940s. Most people don't hear about that because this was around the time that Israel was established, and Israel absorbed them with open arms, and they eventually became citizens of Israel. But anti-Semitism is really something that I think the mainstream media leaves out of this equation when talking about this conflict. I watched some hit on MSNBC the other day, and you know, for 10 minutes they were trying to come up with explanations for why Hamas would launch such a brutal attack on innocents. And they never mentioned Hamas's charter. They never mentioned their goal. They never mentioned, you know, what they're so clear about trying to achieve, which is not a Palestinian state, as many people in the West assume, but actually the destruction of global Jewry.
اللهم عليك بيهود شل أركانهم ودمر كيانهم اللهم مكننا من رقاب يهود اللهم مكننا من رقاب يهود فلقد اقترب يوم ذبحكم وصالكم والقضاء عليكم حتى لا يبقى يهودي ولا صهيوني على وجه هذه الأرض. عقيدتنا في قتالكم أننا سنبيدكم على بكرة أبيكم ولن نبقي منكم أحدا.
It says in their charter that they want to eliminate every Jew from the land of Israel, from the Zionist entity, and then move on to the rest of the world. So we're talking really about genocidal anti-Semitism here. Unfortunately, in a lot of Arab Muslim cultures, kids are still raised with Jew hatred from a very early age, right? You have books like Mein Kampf or the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which are still very, very popular in these places. And it's really become part of their mentality as they grow up. And this is the case in Gaza too, because Hamas rules with an iron fist. It's a terrible, terrible regime to be living under. And they raise their people in the curriculum, in the mosques, in the media with state-sanctioned anti-Semitism.
One of the things we've been discussing is this has been kind of a clarifying moment for some people. Certainly a lot of people I've spoken to, some people you've spoken with, they kind of didn't realize the brutality or just sort of the extreme depravity of the type of things that happened during this invasion, desecration of corpses, rape, as a tool of war. There are many things that children, I have a close friend that whose friend's grandmother was executed while they used her own Facebook live stream to kind of alert the world to what was happening. I mean, this kind of stuff. So it can be hard for people in the West to fathom this kind of thing. The glee that's shown on the faces of some people committing these acts and so forth. And I think that when people are brought up with this idea of that it's okay and right and good to hate people at this their very existence, it can lead to that. It's incredibly disturbing just as a concept. And this is I actually personally I think this is one of the most terrible forms of abuse that's inflicted on people, is to teach people that way, to believe that hate of any sort is is not only acceptable, but is an appropriate and almost positive somehow thing that you should accept in society from a very young age.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been this mainstream media, this messaging going on for decades, really since the Six-Day War, that this conflict is really about land, right? But in actuality, if you go back in history and you really understand how this conflict has played out, and you listen to Palestinian media, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, formerly known as Judea and Samaria, then you recognize that this is actually a tribal war, that this is really about ideology. It is really about religion. Jews have been hated since time immemorial, and anti-Semitism is a really interesting form of hatred, right? It's no worse, no better than any other form of hatred, but it functions a little bit differently than, say, anti-Black racism, for example. Anti-Semitism is sometimes very difficult to recognize unless somebody is blatantly saying something like "gas the Jews," like we just saw at the Sydney Opera House, where thousands gathered supposedly in support of Palestine, and yet they were chanting "gas the Jews." Anti-Semitism punches up as well as down, and what that means is that in addition to Jews being seen as lesser than, inferior, vermin, rats, they are also seen as all-powerful, master manipulators, the puppet masters holding the strings, right?
Right, the protocols of the Elders of Zion
Exactly.
material, right?
Exactly. So fundamentally, anti-Semitism at its core is a conspiracy theory, and it morphs to suit the needs of a given society, right? Jews are historically the scapegoats when something is going wrong in society. At the beginning, Jews were hated because we supposedly killed Christ, right? We were hated for our religion. And then after the Enlightenment, science and even eugenics, right, became kind of the highest of moral values, and Jews were then hated for their race, right? During the Holocaust, Hitler said that Jews were a race and that we were the inferior race. And now, the values that are very important to us in society are human rights, right? International human rights. And so the shift, it's moved from Jews as a people to Jews as a nation. Israel is the collective Jew. It's the only Jewish country in the world. And like I said, it's the size of New Jersey, and yet the amount of focus on this tiny country that that we get from the media and from academia and even in our halls of Congress is just staggering, and nobody imagines why. Nobody imagines that less than 100 years after the Holocaust, this could have anything to do with anti-Semitism.
Well, I think there's another element here too, if I may. Increasingly here in Canada and the United States, there's been a whole load of education around how the West is collectively, Western civilization is evil. It's actually, probably shouldn't even exist and is the source of a lot of the ills of the world. And I think Israel, being the only Western real nation in that region, surrounded by a whole bunch of countries which have a very different value system, the Western approach is the source of evil in the world, and if it wasn't for the U.S. doing all the terrible things it does, we'd be in a much better place. I think that's a preposterous view, but I think that also lands on Israel in the area of the same vision.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to an incredibly successful propaganda campaign that have led academics to believe that Israel is some sort of Western colonialist nation coming in and stealing indigenous land, when in reality, again, we can get into the history. I'm very happy to do that, but that's, that would take quite a long time. And if you go back in time, you see that Jews have never left this land for thousands of years. They never left, despite so many of them being exiled from the land. They always came back. There was always a presence there. The land was known as Judea and Sumeria. Arabs are from Arabia. The French are from France. And Jews are from Judea. It's very, very simple. And you might say, well, aren't Palestinians from Palestine? And what a lot of people don't know is that the term Palestine is actually a colonialist invention. It was always Judea and Samaria until the Romans came and conquered the region, and they had to disassociate it, once again, disassociate the land from its roots, and they renamed the land Syria Palestina, referring to the Philistines who were battling with the Jews. And so that term Palestine isn't so much indigenous as it is colonialist. And the identity of a Palestinian actually referred to Jews before 1948. You had something like the Palestine Post, which was a pre-Israel newspaper. That was a Jewish newspaper. And the idea of a Palestinian Arab, as a national identity, started in the 1960s with Yasser Arafat. But before then, Palestinians didn't see themselves as a distinct national identity. They saw themselves as Arab, maybe Syrian Arab or Jordanian Arab. And that doesn't mean that, now they don't identify as a people. They certainly do, and that's valid. But if we go back and we trace the roots and the indigeneity, we find cracks in the mainstream narratives about Palestine. When Jordan illegally occupied the West Bank after 1948, which nobody talks about, right? People love to talk about the Israeli occupation, but nobody talked about Jordan when it was occupying Judea and Samaria from 1948 to 1967. And they ethnically cleansed its Jewish inhabitants from that region. They destroyed synagogues and cemeteries. It was horrific. And in order to disassociate the land from its Jewish roots, they renamed it the West Bank, meaning west of the Jordan River. And so a lot of what people today consider Israeli settlers, right, in the West Bank, a more accurate moniker for them would be refugees, because many of them are simply returning after they had families, 1-2 generations ago that were ethnically cleansed from that land. You know, Nikki Haley was really attacked the other day for her comments in the media. She said, this is not just a war on Israel, this is a war on America. And I understand why she was attacked, and I don't think that that was necessarily a productive way to say what she wanted to say. But I understand her sentiment. These jihadist groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, and there's so many too in South Asia and Africa, they might seem like distinct enemies because they're all kind of fighting with each other and vying for power. But if you actually look at their charters, if you read their charters and you read what they want, they all have the same goal: destruction of Western civilization, right? And the replacement with a global caliphate, Islamic caliphate. And that starts with the Jews, right? Because Judeo-Christian values, right? Jews are, in a lot of ways are the foundational element of Western civilization, or at least Western morality. Right, and so they first believe that they have to wipe out the Jews, global Jewry, and then you go to America, and the rest of the West will fall. So that's kind of what Nikki Haley meant by that, because she kind of really understands the ideology behind these fundamentalist groups.
Thanks for that, Karis. I do want to touch on one more thing, and it's just something I've observed. For example, looking at the Russia-Ukraine war from the beginning in the U.S. at least, and certainly in Canada, let's say the powers that be have been telling lots of lies. Basically, a lot of people feel like they've been propagandized. They don't want to trust anything that's coming from the narrative. In some cases, people have this reflexive reaction to be just whatever is the narrative, the opposite must be true. I even understand that and sympathize with it. If you stand with Ukraine, right, then that became almost like a tribal moniker or something like that. You couldn't just say, look, this is terrible. Ukraine has just been invaded by Russia and people are being killed. This is, I see a similarity there. People are hearing, oh, you need to stand with Israel, right? And what does that mean? And some people, because of this phenomenon I just described, reflexively go to the other side of this without really just thinking about what happened. And I want to encourage people to think about what you saw, think about what happened. Because it's such a small population, relatively, everyone almost knows someone by 1 or 2 degrees of separation that has been impacted in a horrible way, killed, abducted, whatnot. So there's a lot of near first-hand accounts that are possible for people to get. I want to explore this a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, even myself, I have family there in Israel, and I just found out yesterday that kibbutz where those 40 babies were butchered and some of them decapitated. I realized last night that I had been to that kibbutz. I stayed on that kibbutz for a week because my first cousin used to live there and work there with her boyfriend at the time. His whole family is still there. They hid in a bomb shelter for over 48 hours. Thank God they are all safe, but most of their friends are dead. To your point about Ukraine, I sympathize with people who are hesitant to jump on any sort of bandwagon, especially when it comes to war. When you say I stand with Israel versus I stand with Ukraine, you're saying something a little different. When you say I stand with Ukraine, what you're saying is I stand against Putin, and I stand with Ukraine in terms of it being victorious in this war. But when people say I stand with Israel, I hope what they mean is that they recognize that this is an existential war for Israel. It's a war of survival. Israel's the only country in the world that it has become acceptable to question its right to exist, right? We talk about taking out the Iranian regime or the North Korea regime, but we never question these nations' existence, their right to exist as a sovereign state. And so when you say I stand with Israel, what you're saying is I stand with the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, because there's been such a accepted narrative that Israel has no right to exist. And also, I watched Tucker Carlson the other day talking about some of our officials' responses to this, and God bless Tucker. I think he's wonderful in a lot of respects, but I think he really missed something going on here. He's wary of us getting into another war, right? And he criticized Lindsey Graham for saying that Biden should be threatening Iran right now, and he thinks that we should stay out of it. But I don't think Tucker understands the details. And here's what he's missing. Israel faces Hezbollah in the north, which is another genocidal terrorist organization that has as its foundational mission the destruction of the Jewish state and every last Jew inside it. Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles, more precise missiles than Hamas has, pointed directly at Israel. Everybody in the north is terrified that Hezbollah is going to take advantage of this moment and they are going to strike. So there has been a massive mobilization of Israeli troops on the northern border. They might even start evacuating the kibbutzim there. And if Hezbollah strikes, Israel will need assistance from the US and from Europe if that situation arises. So I actually support what Lindsey Graham said. He offered a very good deterrent to this situation that would almost guarantee that America is not dragged into another war, which nobody wants, and that is to threaten Iran's capacity to produce oil. All Biden would have to say is, should you give Hezbollah the green light, because Hezbollah, just like Hamas, is a puppet of Iran, and they don't, they take instruction of when to strike from Iran. If Hezbollah gives the green light, Biden could say if Iran gives the green light to Hezbollah, Biden could say, then we will send a few missiles over and we will take out your oil refineries. Iran has 4 oil refineries. If Iran has no capacity to produce oil, the regime is done. This is the regime's, this is what they rely on. They are sanctioned by most of the Western world, and they get all of their money from China, from North Korea, from Russia, through oil. And I cannot imagine Iran would take the muzzle off of Hezbollah if they thought for a moment that we were going to destroy their capacity to produce oil. I mean, that is what deterrence means. And so the way that I looked at Lindsey Graham's proposal is actually a way to prevent America from entering a war.
Well, Karis, thank you for sitting down with me, on camera for once.
Thank you, and now it's back to work.